today we are going to learn how to make a simple schema and then tables in MySQL. So first things first, we are going to put our first prompt, which is to create a schema, also known as a database, which we will call bookstore. And with all of our prompts that we are telling our database to, we need to end everything with a semicolon, just so that we don't confuse the program too much. And then we're going to tell the program that we're going to use the schema that we've just created. And finally, we're going to start making our first table, which we will call books, nice and simple. And we're not ending that one with a semicolon because there's still more information we need to add in. So we're telling it which variables we need to put in. So first things first will be our book ID, which we're going to say is going to be an integer or an int that is going to auto increment, which means we don't need to put information in for those. It is going to do it itself. It's going to start at 1, and any additional information you put in will be numbered appropriately afterwards. It's also going to be our primary key. And then for our next variable, again, we're not ending with a semicolon, we're ending with a comma to say, hey, there's still more coming. So next thing after that will be our title, which is a varchar, which just means we can have multiple characters. And then we're going to tell the database how many characters can possibly be in it, which is 100. Moving on to the author first name. And as you'll note, we have started it with a lowercase, moving on to capitals to indicate, hey, there's a couple different words here. And again, it's going to be a varchar. And this one's going to be up to 50 characters. Finally, the author's last name, which is a varchar, again, 50. Finally, moving on to the last one, which will be our price, which is a decimal. And then we're going to tell it how many characters, again, can possibly be in it. So it's up to 10 with a decimal place of 2. And finally, we'll end that by closing our initial bracket here and finally putting a semicolon to say, hey, all that information is done. You can execute that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to highlight everything. We're going to hit this lightning bolt up here to try and execute our prompts. And we're saying, hey, we have a green check mark with our creating our schema, a green check mark to use, and green check mark to create, which means everything's being done correctly. We'll come over here to our schemas, hit this little refresh icon, and look, there it is. Next thing, we're going to be inserting data into our wonderful new table that we just made. And then we're going to tell our program how we're going to be putting information in. So it's going to start with our title. It's going to move on to the author first name, the author last name, and finally the price. And again, everything has to be written exactly as we first put it up in when we put our variables. So always double check that you have that done correctly. Again, we don't need a semicolon here because we're still writing more information. So it's going to say, hey, we need these values put in. Or anytime we have varchars, we're going to say, hey, that's going to be in quotation so you know what is actually being put into the variable. And as you'll note, all of the prompts that we're using when we're saying, hey, program do this, they all need to be fully capitalized to separate what is known by the program and what we are telling the program to do. And then again, we separate everything out with commas. And finally, because our price is not a varchar, it doesn't need to have the quotations around it. So we'll close off that bracket, we'll put our semicolon, and that insertion is complete. So what we'll do, because we've already created everything, we're simply going to highlight what we've just done. We're going to hit the execute button again. So as we see here, it's saying that, hey, book doesn't exist because we need to make sure everything is exactly done as it was before. So we didn't put the S there. So now we'll double check, look at that. We've got a green check mark. We're good to go. What we can also do is we'll do a simple select query. So we're going to select and then put an asterisk, and that's saying, hey, I want everything out of this done. So we're going to select it from, and then our table books. So when we run this, then we should get a nice little grid down here saying, hey, here's your book ID, the title, the first name, last name, and price exactly as we've put in. So that's all good. Now we can create a second table. So we're going to create a table, and this one's going to be called customers. So again, our customer ID is our first one, which is going to be an integer. Again, much like here where we see our book ID. It's going to auto increment, and it'll be our primary key. And then we need our customer first name, which will be a varchar. You can always make these as big as you need them to be, but just pay attention to sizes. So you don't need it to be too big if you're not going to have things out that big. So 50, usually for names, especially if we're splitting them between a first and last, is about all you will need. And again, we need to end everything with either a comma or a semicolon to indicate that it is done. So now we're moving on to our customer last name. Similar to the first, is going to be a varchar, 50 characters. And then we will end everything off with the customer email. Because emails tend to be a bit longer than a first or last name separate, that one will be given more allowance as a varchar. So it'll be 100 because this is our last piece of data to put in, or our last variable. We then don't need the comma. We will end it by closing our first initial bracket and ending it with a semicolon.
And now we are going to insert into, again, all capitals because it's a MySQL prompt, into table customers in the order of customer first name, customer last name, and finally customer email. Let's be sure we do not yet put a semicolon because we aren't finished our prompt. Next, we have to tell it which values we want to put in to our customers table. And we're going to make sure that we surround our varchars with quotations to establish which are which, and separate with commas, and end off with a semicolon. Then we can do a quick select all query to see all of the info that we've just entered into our customers table. And we highlight the section that has not yet been executed, hit that execute button, and sure enough, there are green check marks, and there's our table. And finally, we will create our last table, so we will use the create table prompt and call this table orders, open bracket. We will have one called order ID. It will be an int, auto increment, and another primary key. You'll note that all of our tables have a primary key. The reason for it will be just in 1 second. We will explain. So first we'll have a purchase date, and it will be a date that will be in the format of year, month, day. And our next column will be customer ID. It will be an int, and it sounds familiar, so does book ID. Also an int. And we will establish that, yes, we do have foreign keys from another table. So we will address that by saying foreign key as a prompt and tell them which one it is. So it is customer ID. Oh, and do not forget commas between. There we go. And so our customer ID it's referenced or references the table customers. And in that table, it is also called customer ID. And the next foreign key will be book ID, references the books table, and it is also called book ID in that table as well. And we're going to finish that off with our closed bracket and a semicolon. And finally, we are going to insert into our orders table in the form of purchase date, customer ID, and followed by the book ID. So these values will be, and put the date in quotations, again, year, and then month, and then day, and quotations, separate with commas, and don't forget your ints do not need quotations. And finish with a semicolon. And then we'll write a little query for select all from our orders table. Finish that off with a semicolon. And it's also good to note those little red X's in the sidebar telling me that I had mistyped a comma. So we're going to highlight it all, hit that execute button, and there are our 3 check marks. And there's our table and then all of our information in it. So there you have it. We have shown you how to make a simple database, create tables, insert data, and perform basic queries. Thank you for watching.